Okay, so this video is going to take us through the concepts of building a section perspective in Revit, as well as moving into a little bit of Photoshop compositing in terms of starting to build a really solid image from line work coming out of Revit. So let's start by going into level 1 floor plan. And I'm going to take a section perspective, build a section perspective looking this direction. And this is not a really complicated building. So I'm not going to get any wild results, amazing newfound things by doing a section perspective. So it will give us an idea of looking at these specific techniques. So the first thing that I need to do is set up a camera view. And I'm going to set it up just like any typical exterior perspective as a camera view. And I'm going to send it a little bit across and reshape my bounding box just a little bit. And quickly removing or hiding, I should say, some of the elements that I don't want in the view. Let's get rid of this little structural system here. That was the foundation. There we go. A little bit tricky to select that dude. Okay, that should be good. So this is the basics of the section perspective that I have. Hide view, that guy goes away also. Okay, so this is ready to turn into a section perspective. The next thing that I want to do is definitely rename my rendering so that I rename this view so that I can find it quickly in my list. Always name your views. Always name your views. Level 1, back to level 1. I'm going to go to my 3D view list and I'm going to right click on section perspective and say show camera. I know one of the first adjustments that I want to make, I'm just going to left click and drag this around. I want to be a little bit more in line with this wall just for how I'm cutting the section perspective and what I'm revealing. I want to see a little less of this exterior wall, a little bit more of the inside. Next, with this camera selected, I'm going to come down and turn on section box in that 3D views properties. What that is going to allow me to do is come back and right click on section perspective again and say show section box. I can drag that into my building and I can also rotate it. This is a little bit clunky in terms of how it works right now, but I can rotate that around just a little bit to kind of get it a little bit more in line. I want this edge to be parallel to the exterior wall of my building. So it doesn't really rotate around in real time. So you can see I'm just kind of having to nudge it back and forth a little bit. It might be that I can actually set up a more precise rotation, but not really. So it's just one of those tools you just kind of have to finesse it for a bit until you get approximately what you're looking for. And again, not get too caught up in is it exactly right or not. So with that done now, when I go back to my section perspective, I still have this section box turned on. Oh, I need to make sure my camera is selected. Show camera. That camera is selected and you'll be able to see that section box is turned on. When I go to my section perspective, I now have a cutting plane that goes through both the terrain and the building. So for something like this, for a drawing like this, what I typically want to do now is a few touch-ups in terms of the line weights. Again, this project is very much about site and sort of nestling in, so I do want enough of the site in place. I'm kind of happy with how that's going to start looking. But I definitely want to come in and tweak the line weights just a little bit. It'll save me a little bit of time in Photoshop or Illustrator or whatever your post touch-up tool of choice is going to be. So to do that, I'm going to come down to my graphic display options. I'm going to turn on smooth lines with anti-aliasing. Let's take a look at that really quick, actually. Let me zoom in on an edge here so we can see what's happening when we do that. Graphic display options, smoothing lines, apply. You'll see all of these edges basically get a little more tonality around the edges. So it gives me that appearance. It reduces the quality, or it increases the quality, improves the quality, in particular these diagonal lines. So always want to do that first. Next, silhouette lines. I turn those to wide lines, and that just gives me a little bit of graphic punch in terms of which lines are going to be displayed as a heavier line weight. Typically, I'll turn on shadows and ambient shadows. The ambient shadows create a little bit of a gradient across the walls. That's what this appearance is here. And then cast shadows gives me these more precise shadow lines across. Sketchy lines, something that you can use with some success on a drawing like this. It would be something that I'm typically not going to use. I'm more interested in sort of the precision of the line drawing in this case. Depth cueing is something you can use at times to some good effect. Next, on my shadows, if I'm going to print, if it's not something I'm displaying on screen, I always want to pull my shadow contrast right here way down. And you'll see that's going to lighten up these edges. Things are going to print much, much nicer when I do that. I think that's it from the list that I would start working on. So I'm going to simply say OK to that. And then we'll zoom out. And I'm going to export this. I'm not building a rendering of this in this particular video. I'm going to move to more of a photorealistic style of this, leveraging Photoshop in this video rather than actually doing a rendering. So we're going to do a little bit of compositing with this. I want to cover that as a strategy as well. So in this particular case, I'm really interested in the line work. So I'm going to go use a print method, and I'm going to be using Qt PDF Writer. Any PDF writer should work just fine. I'm going to go to my setup, and I'm going to export this as an 11 by 17. I want something fairly high in its resolution. And I'm just going to use fit to page in this particular case. I'm going to say OK, and current window is selected and preview. And so this should build a reasonably high resolution drawing for me to work over the top of inside of Photoshop. So I'll click print and OK. And then we'll just save this out. Section perspective.pdf. So inside of Photoshop, I'm going to click open, and I'm going to select my section perspective. Open, and we are going to turn that into an 11 by 17 at 300 DPI and say OK. So this should give me a reasonably high resolution image to begin working over the top of. So if I look at that at 100%, I have nice crisp line work, and I have a lot of detail that I can start working over the top of. And I'm not going to cover everything. There are some absolutely excellent tutorials in terms of using Photoshop to touch up architecture, to build architectural imagery. And we can refer to some of those in the links underneath the video on the YouTube page. But I want to get you started with some of the basics. So the first thing that's really important to understand is using the selection tools, of which the one that I tend to spend the most time with is the polygonal lasso tool and paths. So we're going to look at that at the first one. And this is a pretty simple project. There's not a great deal of complexity. So this is something that, we might consider this a little bit overdone, but I want to show the steps anyway in terms of how to work through this. So I'm going to use a polygonal lasso. I'm going to start right here, right in the middle of these larger black lines, and I simply want to be able to poche the inside of this wall. And it's certainly something that I could do in Revit, but in this case, I'm going to leverage Photoshop a bit more to build up the imagery. And as I make these selections, I can certainly just sort of say, okay, that is just fine as a selection. And I'm going to use that, select it. I'm going to go to my paint bucket tool, which is somewhere, there we go, my paint bucket tool, and paint that black to get that entire surface pocheted in. But if this is a selection that I might want to come back and use at a later date, inside of Photoshop, I would want to go to Paths and I'm going to click this little button right down here, make work path from selection. And I can just then go ahead and at any point I can come back and select and activate that path. I might want to name that. We can call this section cut. So that at any point I can go back, select section cut, and then click on my selection tool, load path as selection, and I have that selection right back. Again, in a smaller section like this, I might not need to keep all of my paths, but if this was a much larger, much more complicated drawing, it's a really useful tool to know about. Let's go back to layers, select, and deselect. So if I start looking at some of the things that I might want to add into this drawing to start building this up, one of the first things would be the ground plane. Getting in a really nice image in the background, not of grass, and trying to render out grassy looking stuff on the topography plane in Revit typically just looks terrible. So let's look at using Photoshop to bring in an image of grass that is also in perspective, that's doing something a bit similar, that I can start using as a way to build up a better image. So I'm going to go to File, Open, and I need to get to my correct folder here really quickly. Lots of stuff. Not as organized as I should be. Catastrophic failure. That does not seem favorable at all. This PC. Take a look at that later. That was kind of an exciting error message to receive. 225 composite, and I'm just going to go ahead and open up a whole series of things so I don't need to continually come back and open things up. So we'll open up all of these images and we'll begin working through them. So the first piece is right here, this image of a wonderful little grassy field here. So I'm going to use my rectangular marquee, and I'm going to select a large group of this. If I was really clever, I might go ahead and come across the top edge and get a little bit of that, but I'm going to keep it a little bit simple here. I just go Edit, Copy, and then into my section perspective, paste. And as grass goes, maybe this is just a bit out of scale, but that's all right. I'm going to be just sort of roughing this in. Hopefully everybody's getting the idea of how to begin building these things together. So I'm going to rename my layer in Photoshop to grass, and I'm going to use Edit, Transform, Distort to pull this up right about to the top. And then I also want to get this edge something just about like that as well. And then I'm going to pinch that in, sort of continue to help force the perspective just a little bit. So this is some pretty large grass stuff here. But, you know, again, this is sort of a wilderness kind of park thing, and I kind of like it. It's a little, maybe it's a little bit exaggerated, but I'm okay with that. Let's take the opacity. I'm going to reduce the opacity down a bit. And once again, I'm going to use the polygonal lasso to come across and begin cropping out the portions that I don't want. So the polygonal lasso, I'm going to start right here on the edge of the building. And again, I'm definitely being a bit of a slop artist with this. So do a better job than I'm doing in terms of selecting out the edges here. But I'm just going to follow my topography around. Nobody wants to watch me spend hours with the polygonal lasso, so again, I'm going to go fast. And wrap up my selections here in just a second. Let's zip back up to this, and then I'm going to come across the top. Now, as you're using the polygonal lasso, something that happens often is a misclick. Oh no, I really didn't want it to be way up there. The backspace button in Photoshop will always move you back one click. It's kind of like a really quick version of an undo while you're building what can sometimes be a really fairly complicated selection inside of Photoshop. So that done, I actually don't want to delete this interior portion right here. So if I hit the delete button, that's going to get rid of the inside and keep the outside. So let's undo that. What I actually need to do is invert my selection, select inverse, delete, and that's going to crop that portion out. So select, deselect, and let's turn its opacity back up. So as green grass goes, something like this. This is, in terms of the tonality, this is really aggressive. It's starting to get some photorealistic qualities about it, which is nice, but it's just too much green. And green on a page, especially something that is printed out, has a tendency to really just jump off of the page, pull your eye to it. So I typically come in and like to tone these things down. And one of the better tools that I like to do that with is adjustments, under image, adjustments, and variations. And I'm just going to add a little bit of red, magenta, and just kind of give that a little bit more of a brown tonality to it. I'm going to use a lot of nature tones in this final composition, so just giving that a little bit more brown is going to push it into the background and make it read just a little bit nicer for me. So the next thing, this edge right here isn't quite what I want it to be, because the grass is just suddenly stopping and sort of clipped off by the building. So I want to come in with the clone tool in Photoshop and select a brush that has a little bit of a grunge quality to it, something like this guy right here. And what I'm going to do with that is I'm just going to use the clone tool. So I'm going to hit the Alt button to select what area that I want to clone. And I'm just going to kind of push up some of the edges on this. Looks like I need to increase the size of that brush just a little bit. There we go. Same kind of trick. And I'm just going to kind of soften this edge up. And what I'm looking for is just something to pull that edge up a little bit, soften the connection between the ground plane and the building. And there are a variety of brushes. I'm not sure I've got the exact best brush to do this with right now. Let's try just a little bit of a different one here. Maybe this guy. And continue to kind of work that. There we go. That's a little bit better actually. It's got a little bit of a harder edge to it. But what I'm looking to do, I can be crazy and kind of go in and paint per blade of grass. But for me, just beginning to get a softer edge right here is going to do the trick. Something that, again, begins to trick the eye into thinking that there is a softer, nicer connection right there. And at the same time, I want to do something really similar with this top edge. So I'm going to go back to my clone tool, a smaller brush, and again, kind of keeping those things parallel and just start to work the detail along this top edge to soften up the relationship between ground and sky. And again, that's something I can go absolutely crazy with and make too much of a mess of things. I have a tendency to kind of come through, especially early on in my renderings while I'm building them, and do a minimal amount of work and then come back and resolve and spend more energy where it needs it later on. So the next thing that I want to start adding in, let's take a look at adding some material to the building itself. So this really isn't an exterior siding per se, but I can come in really quickly with an image like this, edit, copy, and edit, paste. And I can position this in place over the top edge of a building and start to leverage it as a building material rather than actually applying it in my Revit model. And there are pros and cons to both processes. This is great for building a quick image. So I'm going to use the perspective tool, simply scrunch it down a bit, and let's use the scale tool while I'm at it. Get this image a little bit smaller. There we go. I want to get this top edge right here about lined up with that image. Go back and activate perspective again. and I'm going to pull the siding down so that I'm matching my perspective lines. So I know I can use the top edge of these windows right here. Should give me a good sense of perspective. Scrunch it down just a little bit more. Line that up. Pull that out just a little bit. And then I'm going to use distort, transform, and distort to pull this in as well. So we can get that kind of look. Next thing, once again, I'm going to come around the perimeter with the polygonal lasso. To select the areas that I want to be able to erase. Select inverse, delete, back to my transparency and opacity. Select deselect. I'm going to rename this layer siding. And then let's punch out the brightness and contrast on that a little bit as well. Image, adjust, brightness, contrast. I'm kind of old school, so I like to turn on use legacy. It just gives me a little bit more drama in terms of that. Something that's sort of this nice brown rain screen looking like material. Scale wise, that might be just a little bit too big. Those look like they might be 12-inch planks, something like that. But again, you're getting the idea of how to apply that. Now, one of the things you'll notice is I did lose my shadow that was cast by the overhang, by the eave on the roof. So there's a couple of things that I can do with that in terms of really quick tricks to do. The first one is, again, I can use my polygonal lasso and really quickly select that shadow area. Then I'm going to turn my opacity back up, and I can simply, again, use the selection to adjust only that portion. Drop the contrast just a little bit, drop the brightness, select, deselect to build that shadow in. Or let's do this one other method, select. Oh, let's do an undo. So I'm going to go to my history. Let's go back before the polygonal lasso. The other tool that I can use is dodge and burn. So in this particular case, I'm actually going to use burn and a slightly smaller brush for this just to get the area. And I can come in and I can darken this area up. So I'm going to do my first pass right here while my opacity is still down, just so I can kind of see where I'm going. And then I'm going to do my second pass just by sort of using this burn tool and kind of building that. And the nice thing about the burn tool is it gives me a little bit softer edge, which is something I could build when I have my selection by coming in and doing select and then modify the selection and adding a feather to the selection. But there's also something nice, a little bit more random about using that burn tool that works really well also. So let's add in a tree next, and then we'll do sky last. And again, I'm not going to go too far into all of this, just enough so you can start to see how this is coming together. So let's go to our tree. I believe I should have one of the tree, and look for a tree that's already been cut out. They're much easier to work with. So I'm going to go to edit. Oh, excuse me, select all, edit, copy, back into my section perspective, and paste it in place. Let's move it over. I'm going to plant it right there. So I need to scale it down. Edit, transform, scale. Scale it way, way down. And get it placed about where we want it here. Rename that layer tree right, since it's on the right hand side of my image. So there's a few things, like right now it definitely looks like it is just floating there in the grass, which isn't so good. One of the first problems is it's not casting a shadow and it is not interacting with the ground plane in any kind of way. So let's add a shadow to it first. So to do that, I'm going to duplicate the layer, tree right shadow. I'm going to slide tree right shadow underneath tree right. And I'm going to go edit, transform, distort. And I'm simply going to pull it down in the similar direction that I know my daylight is coming from. So if I'm casting a shadow somewhat like this, and also like this across these windows, I know I want this to do something along these lines right here. So shadows typically don't carry color with them very much, so I'm going to go ahead and go to Image, Adjust, Desaturate, turn it black and white, Image, Adjust, Brightness, Contrast, and pull the contrast. Oh, we really want to pull all of the contrast out of it. Make it just a shade darker. And then we're going to decrease its opacity, something about like that. Next, we want to erase, and again, I could use the polygonal lasso to do this, but I'm just going to really quickly use the erase tool in this case, slightly smaller brush to get in and get rid of some of these details right here. Okay, and then once I have that, I want to make sure the shadow doesn't look like it's floating over the top of the grass. So again, I'm going to go back to my eraser, and let's select a brush that's got a bit of grunge to it. Size that up just a little bit. I'm just going to kind of come through and touch out a little bit of the shadows here and here, just to kind of have that broken up by the grass pattern a little bit. Some things in front, some things behind. Let's go back to my grass layer while I'm zoomed in on the base of the tree. I'm going to use my clone tool. And, well, actually, let's go back. Let's use the eraser. That seems like a better option, actually. And let's erase a little bit of the grass, or a little bit of the base of the tree, and let that grass kind of show up as if it's coming up over in front of the tree. Again, just some really, really simple little tricks to do. I need to touch up that portion of the shadow just a little bit right there. And again, just breaking that up just enough so that the shadow doesn't look like it's floating over the top of the grass. Let's go back and pick my eraser up one more time here, a little bit smaller on my brush size, just to clean that up. And then on my tree, same kind of trick right here. We need this probably not coming in front of the building. And same thing with the grass. I've got a little bit of grass right up here coming in front of the building as well. Don't want that either. Okay, so let's zoom back out, and you can start to see how this image is going to come together. So we need to get a sky background in. That'll be sort of the last step that I'm going to do, with the idea that you should be seeing now how all of this can start to come together really, really quickly to build. Again, I'm not really a fan of pushing photorealism, but can start to push a little bit more of a realistic sense of how the building and the site and some of the key materials are going to work together in your composition as a design. So let's grab our sky background. Let's see here. I didn't bring it into this folder, desktop. Hoping it's back in here someplace. Clouds, background, open. Marquee tool. Edit. Copy into my section perspective. Edit. Paste. This is a little bit too low resolution for what I need in particular on this, but we'll scale it up. We'll make it work. It'll be just fine. I'm going to put it in that top corner. Edit, transform, scale. And what I mean in particular by too low resolution, if I scale this up too much, we're definitely going to see some pixelization with the clouds. It's kind of okay. It's not looking too bad at all. But it's definitely something that you want to watch for. So again, I'm going to decrease my opacity so that I can really quickly come in with my polygonal lasso tool and I'm going to select what I would like to keep in this particular case. Select inverse, delete, turn my opacity back up, select, deselect, and you can start to see how this is going to play out. A little bit of touch-up work that needs to be done on a few edges where I got a little sloppy with the polygonal lasso. And again, I can choose to touch that up simply by using the eraser tool, sort of erasing out some of those parts. Again, for me, especially larger surface areas, you can see how that just seems way more tedious than simply coming in with the lasso. And just zipping across it like that. Let's finish that off and hit delete. Much cleaner method than spending hours with that eraser and trying to get it to look right. So with that, I can get my sky coming together. I've got a good connection between the sky and the background. Anything that I want to start removing from the background as well. Oh gosh, I'm missing that edge right there. That's going to drive me crazy if I don't fix that. So let's get rid of that too. There we go. Select, deselect. So I can continue to work through those kind of things. I can also do some quick tricks with this background layer as well. Since it's primarily two-dimensional line work, I can take that background layer and copy it. And let's do this as lines only. And I can move it to the top, put it on the top of my stack so it's including everything. But then rather than have it as a normal, I can actually set that to multiply. And what multiply does is it sets the image up so that all of my lighter tones are transparent. And so essentially it's building an image that has transparency in it. So there's my line work, but I can allow the white portions of that drawing to be transparent and see-through. So there are a few things that I might want to get rid of, like the topo lines, some things like that, this tree in the background. And those are, again, things that are pretty quick and easy to do. So for instance, if I wanted this sort of gray tree in the background to be gone, I can pretty quickly just zip through that with the eraser, and same thing with these topo lines. Again, should probably, once it gets closer to the building, go through with the polygonal lasso to get things erased that are closer. But you can hopefully get the idea of exactly how these things can come together in a really quick and easy way. So let's double click that and move that out, and you can start to see, if you're looking at this edge, how to put together a really quick, concise, nice looking rendering using the section perspective tool in Revit and a few of the key tools in terms of building a composition with Photoshop, matching some photographs together, getting some key elements built in place to build a very quick but also a really nice image that hopefully pays attention to color palettes, that starts to build the image of what you're wanting the building to do without going through all of the steps to build all the materials and seam all the materials inside of a 3D program like Revit to make sure that the renderings are perfect. This has a tendency to get things out and get things moving a little bit quicker, a little bit more experimentally, and then you can come back and update those things in Revit once you have those final things together.